When we talk about the avoidant individual, we often fall into the trap of interpreting their silence as a statement of intent. We assume that because they have retreated, they have decided that we are no longer important, or that the relationship has lost its value. But I want to challenge that assumption. We must understand that for the avoidant, pulling away is rarely a declaration of indifference. It is, in fact, a sophisticated, albeit maladaptive, self-protective mechanism. It is a reflex triggered by a nervous system that has become overwhelmed by the perceived demands of intimacy. Think of it not as a door closing, but as a pause button. They are desperately pressing because they have reached their emotional capacity. When an avoidant person goes quiet, they are not necessarily rejecting you. They are struggling to regulate their own internal state. They are caught in a conflict between the human need for connection and a deeply ingrained fear that connection is synonymous with loss of self or inevitable disappointment. In that moment of withdrawal, they aren't looking for a way out of the relationship. They are looking for a way to survive the intensity of it. If we view their silence as a hostile act, we respond with anxiety, demands, or accusations, which only confirms their worst fears, that intimacy is dangerous and that they are incapable of meeting our needs. But if we can shift our perspective, if we can see that silence as a cry for help, a signal that they have been flooded and don't reign, how to navigate back to the surface, the entire dynamic changes. This is where the intellectual pivot occurs. We have to stop viewing the avoidant person's behavior through the lens of our own ego. When they pull away, it is not a commentary on your worth. It is a commentary on their current psychological bandwidth. They are essentially saying, I am drowning in the weight of this connection, and I don't have the language to tell you that I still want you here. By misinterpreting this, we lose the opportunity to be the secure base they actually need. We become the very thing they are trying to escape, the pressure that forces them further into their shell. To reach out in these moments is not to chase, it is to offer a lifeline. It is a deliberate act of emotional maturity. It requires you to set aside your own fear of rejection and recognize that their retreat is a symptom of their vulnerability, not their malice. When you reach out with a low-pressure, consistent presence, you are essentially signaling to their nervous system that it is safe to come back out. You are proving that the relationship can withstand their need for space without falling apart. You are teaching them, through your actions, that they do not have to disappear to be safe, and that they do not have to be perfect to be loved. Ultimately, we must realize that the avoidant person is often trapped in a solitary confinement of their own making, waiting for someone to knock on the door, not to break it down, but simply to remind them that they are not alone. So, the next time you feel that silence stretching between you, remember, it is not a wall, it is a threshold. Reach out, not to demand an answer, but to offer a hand, and watch how the silence transforms from a barrier into a bridge. This brings us to what I call the central paradox of the avoidant experience. It is a profound irony that the very people who seem most allergic to intimacy are often the ones who crave it with the most intensity. When you see an avoidant partner pulling away, the instinctual reaction is to view it as a rejection of you, but that is a fundamental misreading of their internal landscape. In reality, they are often retreating precisely because they feel the pull of the connection so strongly that it threatens to overwhelm their fragile sense of autonomy. We have to understand that for the avoidant, intimacy feels like a high-stakes gamble. They operate under a subconscious belief that to be truly known is to be eventually controlled or abandoned. So, when the relationship deepens, their internal alarm bells begin to ring. They pull back not because they don't want you, but because they are terrified of losing themselves in the process. It is a desperate attempt to regain equilibrium. Yet, in that isolation, they are not finding peace. They are finding loneliness. They are sitting in the silence they created, waiting for someone to prove that they are safe enough to be reached. This is where the dynamic shifts from a simple withdrawal to a silent plea. They lack the emotional vocabulary to say, "I am scared of how much I care for you, so I need you to show me that you are still here," without demanding that I perform. They cannot initiate that bridge building, because to do so would be to admit vulnerability, which is the very thing they are running from. By reaching out, you are not engaging in a desperate act of chasing. You are, instead, performing an act of profound psychological generosity. You are signaling that you recognize their fear, that you are not intimidated by their distance, and that you are willing to hold the space for them until they are ready to step back into the light. When you reach out, you are essentially saying, "I see your fear, and I am not going anywhere." This is not about enabling their avoidant behavior. It is about providing the secure base they were likely denied in their earlier developmental years. You are offering a corrective experience. You are showing them that connection does not have to be a battlefield where one person wins and where connection the other loses, or where one person is consumed by the other. You are demonstrating that it is possible to remain connected even when the space between you feels vast. Of course, this requires a tremendous amount of emotional maturity on your part. It requires you to set aside your own ego, the part of you that feels slighted by their silence, and instead look at the human being behind the wall. It requires you to be the one who is secure enough to bridge the gap, not because you are weak, but because you are the one who understands the architecture of their fear. You are the one who can afford to be the bigger person, because you know that their silence is not a wall intended to keep you out, but a barricade they built to keep themselves from falling apart. By reaching out, you are inviting them back into the relationship on terms that feel safe to them. You are offering a hand across the chasm, not to pull them forcibly toward you, but to let them know that the bridge is still standing. It is the ultimate act of relational courage, to pursue someone who is running away, not out of a need for validation, but out of a commitment to the truth of the bond you share. Ultimately, your outreach is the quietest, most powerful assertion of your own security, proving that love is not a pursuit of the elusive, but a patient invitation to the fearful. Once we accept that this silence is a defensive retreat rather than a rejection, we are faced with the question of how to actually bridge that distance. This is where most people falter, because we are conditioned to believe that if someone is pulling away, we must either chase them with intensity or mirror their withdrawal with our own coldness. Both of these responses are catastrophic. If you chase, you validate their fear that you are an encroaching force that will consume their autonomy. If you mirror their silence, you confirm their deepest, darkest suspicion that they are inherently unlovable and that, eventually, everyone leaves. To reach out effectively, we must master the art of low-stakes contact. This is not about playing games or being manipulative. It is about creating a space where the avoidant individual can re-enter the relationship without feeling like they are stepping into a minefield of emotional demands. When you reach out, the content of your message matters far less than the doe's intent behind it. If your outreach is laden with unspoken expectations, if you are texting to check if they are still there for you, or to demand an explanation for their absence, you are essentially throwing a heavy stone into a fragile pond. You are adding pressure to a system that is already struggling to breathe. Instead, think of your outreach as a gentle, non-demanding signal. It is a way of saying, "I am here, I am steady, and I am not going anywhere, but I am also not asking you to be anything other than who you are right now." It might be a simple, light-hearted link to an article you know they'd find interesting, or a brief, warm acknowledgement of something you shared in the past. It is a communication that requires no immediate response, no emotional heavy lifting, and no performance of affection. By removing the requirement for them to show up in a specific way, you lower the barrier to entry. You are essentially offering them a safe harbor. The philosophical shift here is profound. You are moving from a position of needing them to fill your own void to a position of offering them a stable presence. This is an act of immense emotional maturity. It requires you to sit with your own discomfort, the anxiety that arises when you don't get an immediate reply, and choose to remain calm anyway. When you reach out in this way, you are teaching their nervous system that you are not a threat. You are demonstrating that your presence is a constant, not a conditional reward that gets withdrawn when things get difficult. You are not chasing them in the traditional sense. You are simply keeping the door cracked open so that when their own internal panic subsides, they don't have to climb a mountain to find their way back to you. You are making the return path the easiest, most inviting option. It is a subtle, persistent invitation to connection that respects their need for space, while simultaneously refusing to let the relationship dissolve into the ether. Remember, the goal is not to force them to change, but to create an environment where they feel safe enough to choose you of their own volition. By lowering the stakes, you are not diminishing the relationship. You are protecting it from the very pressures that threaten to tear it apart. True intimacy is not found in the demand for presence, but in the quiet, unwavering commitment to remain reachable, even when the other person is temporarily lost in the dark. This brings us to a fundamental shift in how we perceive our role in these relationships. We often find ourselves trapped in the classic anxious-avoidant dance, where one partner chases and the other flees, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. To break this, we must consciously move away from the role of the pursuer, which is essentially a reactive position, and instead step into the role of the anchor. Being an anchor is not about being passive or submissive. It is about embodying a radical, grounded stability. When you are the anchor, you are not waiting for the avoidant person to validate your worth or to dictate the temperature of the relationship. You are, instead, the one who holds the space. You are the one who demonstrates, through your actions and your temperament, that the relationship is a safe harbor, not a battlefield. This is a profound philosophical shift. It requires you to regulate your own anxiety so that you can remain present for them, even when they are in the throes of their own internal chaos. When you reach out from this place of stability, you are offering them something they rarely encounter, a connection that is not contingent on their performance. You are showing them that you can handle their distance without losing your own sense of self. This is the antidote to their fear. The avoidant individual is often terrified that if they let you in, you will eventually become dependent on them, or that you will crumble if they need space. By acting as an anchor, you are proving that you are a whole, autonomous person who chooses to be with them, not someone who needs them to survive. This consistency is the most powerful tool you have. It is not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations of love, which can often feel like an overwhelming weight to someone who is already struggling with intimacy. It is about the quiet, persistent reliability of your presence. It is the steady drip of water that eventually shapes the stone. When you remain consistent, you are slowly rewriting the narrative they have carried their entire lives. The narrative that says, intimacy is a precursor to abandonment or engulfment. You are showing them, through the simple, quiet act of staying, that they don't have to flee to protect themselves. However, this requires a great deal of emotional maturity. It requires you to be comfortable with your own discomfort. It means you must be able to sit with the silence without rushing to fill it with your own anxiety. It means you must be able to offer a hand without grabbing, to invite them back into the fold, without demanding that they explain why they left in the first place. You are essentially inviting them to trust you, not by telling them to, but by being the kind of person who is inherently trustworthy. Ultimately, by becoming an anchor, you are not just changing the dynamic of the relationship, you are inviting the other person to grow alongside you. You are creating the conditions under which they might finally feel safe enough to lower their defenses. You are offering them the permission to be human, to be flawed, and to be distant, without the fear that they will be punished for it. Remember, you cannot force someone to be secure. but you can certainly create an environment where security becomes possible. The goal is not to fix them, but to hold the space long enough for them to realize they no longer need to run. Ultimately, the most difficult work lies not in changing the other person, but in the radical transformation of our own internal narrative. We often enter these relationships with a subconscious script, a belief that we are responsible for our partner's emotional state, or that their withdrawal is a direct indictment of our value. We must dismantle this. If we continue to view the avoidant partner's silence as a deficit we must fix, we remain trapped in a cycle of frustration. Instead, we must learn to cultivate a sense of self-sufficiency that is not dependent on their constant proximity. This is not about detachment or building walls. It is about developing a robust internal life that remains intact, regardless of the fluctuations in the relationship. When you stop looking to your partner to provide the missing pieces of your own security, you stop being a chaser. You become a partner who is capable of holding space for someone else's, a struggle without being consumed by it. This shift is profound because it changes the entire geometry of the relationship. When you are no longer leaning on them for your own emotional regulation, you suddenly become a much safer person to be around. You are no longer a source of pressure, you are a source of calm. This requires a level of psychological maturity that is frankly quite demanding. It asks us to sit with our own discomfort, to tolerate the anxiety of the unknown, and to resist the urge to force a resolution. It asks us to trust that if the relationship is meant to thrive, it will do so not through our frantic efforts to control it, but through the quiet, consistent presence of two individuals who are learning to be vulnerable at their own pace. You are essentially inviting them into a new way of being, one where they don't have to choose between their need for autonomy and their need for love. But remember, this is a two-way street. While you are doing the work of becoming an anchor, you are also setting a boundary for what you are willing to accept. You are not waiting indefinitely for someone who has no interest in meeting you halfway. You are creating the conditions for growth, but you are also acknowledging that growth is a choice they must make for themselves. If you provide the safety, the consistency, and the space, and they still cannot or will not emerge from their shell, then you have your answer. And that answer is not a failure. It is clarity. It is the realization that you have done everything in your power to build a bridge, and now you must decide if you are willing to continue standing on your side of it. True intimacy is not about finding someone who never pulls away. It is about finding someone who, even when they are terrified, chooses to return to the connection again and again. It is a dance of two people who are constantly learning how to be close without losing themselves. So, I ask you to look at your own patterns today. Are you chasing to soothe your own fears, or are you holding space to invite a deeper truth? Stop waiting for the other person to change the dynamic, and start being the change you wish to see in the connection. Because the moment you stop demanding that they complete you, you finally give them the space they need to actually choose you.